When I was small, my father's shoes were as big as boats. As soon as I could stand, my small hand would always be held up waiting for his sandpapery grip to hold. I could see his black scuffed boots right beside my small laced-up shoes as I ran and he walked to the park. I loved it when he bent down to do them up. His huge, work-stained fingers would quickly wave the coloured laces in a magical ritual to make a butterfly bow at the bottom of my falling-down socks, and they would, for at least a minute, keep my shoes firmly on my feet. I always had a brown lace on my left shoe, no matter what coloured shoes I had, because I liked the colour brown. I always had a red lace for my right shoe to help me to remember which foot to put it on. My mum would say with a roll of her tongue, "R for right, R for right, right? Don't forget, R for right. That way you won't forget." But I did. I often was in such a hurry that I would shove my shoes on and have my toes pointing to the 5 continents. Mum would cluck at her tongue and say, "R for right, right?" Now, as he bent down at my feet, he was muttering beneath his breath, not as a curse, but with a well-practised ease, something about "Make the rabbit go down the hole twice around the tree. There you go, as easy as can be." With him in front of me and on his hunkers, our eyes would be at the same height, and I could look at him straight in his face and smell the brill cream in his hair as he laughed and smiled at me. "You're going to have to do this yourself some day. I'm not going to be here forever to do your laces up, you know." When I was small, I couldn't wait for the time that I would have to buy boots just like his, because I thought that that was the way of the world. What your father had, I would have to have. Whenever I was starting to get tired, and I was always getting tired, he would carry me on his back or let me stand on top of his steel toe-capped boots, and together we would walk on them, and he would waltz with me on his feet by the side of the sea and watch the ships floating on the horizon. Sometimes he would hum a tune, and sometimes he would whistle, but I never heard him sing as we moved in time. He would hold me in his capable hands, and I would go from one end of the park by the side of the sandy beach, dancing backwards with my dad, my shoes firmly planted on top of his. I didn't care that I couldn't see where I was going. It was as if we had become one, him so strong and me so small, twirling and laughing in motion. A father and a son, caught in their own special private dance. It wasn't a dance that was limited to the side of the sea. I would always want us to move together, just like Ginger, before dinner, tea and supper. That's what he said every time. Just like Ginger. At night, when it was time for bed, I would shuffle towards him in striped pyjamas and cowboy slippers, with my arms upstretched, and he would smile. "Not again. Just like Ginger. Is that what you want?" He pretended that he was too tired, but it didn't stop me getting at least a few steps in with my dad before he took me to my small bedroom in the room between my grandparents' room at the front of the house and the kitchen. Being so small, I didn't know who Ginger was. There was a boy in my nursery who had a shock of red hair, and everybody said that he was a ginger nut. But I didn't want to dance like him, because he always smelt of baked beans and treacle. I knew that whoever Ginger was, they had to be good, because my dad said so. I remember one sunny Saturday evening. The air was filled with the sharp meadow smell of cut grass when we were dancing on the hard black tarmac at the edge of the park, and my granddad's shoes came up to us, with my granddad in them, of course. They were solid brown brogues that looked as if they had been made from a single piece of the brightest leather the world had ever known. I was fascinated by the way that their sides were pierced with holes of different sizes and shapes, and if I looked hard enough, I could see my growing but gap-toothed smile in them. His enormous trouser turn-ups were a contrast to the razor-sharp, thin-legged style of my father's jeans. I would reach my finger towards those brogues when I was playing on the floor at the grown-ups' feet. It was always just to see what something that shiny felt like. But my grandad would always say, "I spent all day on getting them to shine like a bleeding Sergeant Major's smile, and it ain't no place for a little boy's snotty, bleeding finger." Nana, when she was alive, would tut and say something about, "What's your barrack room language, our George?" Even now, I can't remember what she looked like. She never liked to have a photo took, but I do remember how she would shuffle her tiny, high-laced boots as my mother stifled a laugh and clinked on her pink slip-on high heels in the watery depths of the scullery. On the other hand, I couldn't work out how my grandad knew that I'd had my finger up my nose nearly all day. I couldn't understand why he thought that I'd cut myself, because there wasn't a drop of blood on me. And I really wanted to know what this barrack room language was. Did they have different words for different things? In the barrack room, did they call a spoon a fork? In the barrack room, was a pork pie really a horse? In the barrack room, wherever that was, did they make mystical signs and speak in tongues? Did they do their laces up with their eyelids shut? When I was old enough to wear big boots, I was going to find out just what was what, and I've got to tell you, when no one was looking, I would duck down behind the brown, stimulated leather bed settee and speak bleedin' fluent, bleedin' barrack room language all bleedin' day. I loved the way that these forbidden words slithered over my tempted tongue, and I was determined that I would find myself stamping my strong, toe-capped boots in the barrack room some bleedin' day. Anyway, I don't know what it was that told me that my dad's dad, as opposed to my mum's dad, or any other combination of mum's dad, sister's brother's, mother's, wife's dad. Sometimes it got very confusing when I listened in to the grown-ups' conversation. It all sounded like the vicar of a Sunday when he was ranting and chanting about how these people with really strange names were begetting and begotten. Anyway, as I was saying, I don't know what it was that let me know that my grandad was angry. Perhaps it was the way that I could see that his smart and sturdy brown brogues came to a dead halt in front of my father's chafed boots, so that they were locked toe to toe. It could have been the fact that he stamped his shoes to attention. But there was no doubt about it. From where I was standing with my hand in my father's hand and just a little shorter than my dad's waist, that my granda was not happy. I could hear their voices getting higher and harder, and something about having to feed another mouth, and how come I'm the last to find out, and not enough room to bleedin' swing a bleedin' cat in the bleedin' house as it bleedin' well was. Suddenly I was whisked up, with my dad's hands underneath my armpits, and as I floated and flew through the darkening air, I could just see my granddad's red, angry face as my father lifted me up onto his shoulders. To be honest, from what I'd heard, I was quite excited that we might just be getting a cat as a pet, swinging, bleeding, or otherwise. I liked it up on my dad's shoulders. No, I loved it up on my dad's shoulders. I could see way beyond the sea and the ships. I could just about touch the sky as I clung to his shining, slippery hair. On his shoulders I could shout and savour the echoes of the smoky, lamp-blacked railway arches, and I would see my mum smiling up at me as we walked the summer days away. I was bigger and better than anyone. Even that bleedin' Russian my grandad kept going on about. Hugo, or Huey, gaga bleedin' garden bin, or whatever his bleedin' name was. Now that my nana wasn't in the house, he could say bleedin' any bleedin' time that he wanted to, and he bleedin' well did. Once I was on my father's shoulders. I could look down on my granddad's head with its wide-brimmed grey hat, with its silky navy-blue ribbon. I could hear his voice, but I couldn't see his face, his curly white hair, his spectacles, or the false teeth that clicked and rattled as he ate. That really frightened me. The rattle, click, and grind of his too big for his mouth yellowing teeth. But from my place on the floor, I loved the look and smell of his Sant Major brogues, and I loved him as I sat on his knee. I was forever playing with his great, round, silvery, or was it golden? His silvery watch, with its tickety-timing hands, as he told me stories about Jack and the bleeding giant and his great rusty sword. Just as he was about to start on again about the swinging, bleeding cat, my father rubbed his hard hands over my legs and said, "Enough's enough, Dad. Let's just leave it there. Enough's enough. I don't want the young'un to hear any more." As he spoke and mentioned me, he must have nodded his head up towards me, because I nearly fell over backwards down my dad's back. His voice was directed at me over his shoulder. "Good job I was hanging on to your shoes. Otherwise you'd have been right down on the ground. No doubt about it. You'd have had to have gone to bed with vinegar and brown paper on your head, and your mam would not be pleased." It was comforting to feel the strength of his cat's tongue rough grip on my leg. But as I had tipped and fallen backwards, I had looked around, and I could see right into the twisted branches of the soot-coloured sycamore tree at the edge of the overgrown playing field. It was then that I saw, swaying in amongst its gold and yellowing leaves, a pair of old, worn football boots, and something that looked like my Nana's small, high-laced shoes. They were hanging there, side by side, trapped in the twigs, and tapping against the tree trunk, as if they were out on a Sunday stroll. I tried to reach for them, but even on my dad's shoulders, I still wasn't high enough. He hadn't seen them, and I was filled with a burning curiosity that made me try to get them. I stretched up. I twisted my body to reach higher. I wanted to try again to get them, but my dad and my granddad, angry or not, were now walking side by side back to the house. From the rhythmic sway of his shoulders, I could tell that my dad was taking slow, deliberate steps to make sure that he didn't leave the old man, his father, my granddad, behind. I turned to face the way that he was taking me, knowing full well that we would be coming back to the park soon, really soon. We always did. My Nana always said, "You might as well live in the park," as we were always there so much, and when we came back I would definitely be able to get those shoes. After a while, a very short while, they started to talk to one another again. The voices were much quieter now, and although I couldn't make out what they said, I knew by the sound of their voices, my father's sing-song tones and my granddad's gruff bluster, that they were nearly friends again. With the sound of their talking in my ears, I fell asleep, clinging to my father's neck, with my chin resting on the top of his soapy-smelling hair, as they went up the hill to the house. A few days later, as we walked to school, I told my mum about the shoes in the tree, the football boots and the high-laced shoes. Her laughter was as sweet as two sherry glasses being clinked together at a homecoming party. I asked her how Nana's boots had got up there in amongst the twigs and leaves. The clickety-clack, scritty-scratch of her pink heels stopped as she smoothed down her checkered coat and rubbed at my hair, and she knelt down to look me in the eye. Her face was very close to mine as she spoke, and I could see the deep red of a lipstick smile. I suppose they must have walked up there by themselves after you... She sounded just like Granda when he was telling stories. I suppose they must have walked up there by themselves after you... She stopped talking, and her voice became low. After your Nana. That's your dad's mum. I could see that the smile had gone from her lips, and she was going to cry, but she was trying to be brave in front of me. Look, it's just that your dad's mum. It's just that your Nana isn't with us anymore. Well, I knew that already. I hadn't seen her for weeks. It had been great, because one Thursday I'd been given the day off school for some reason, and so had all of my cousins. Uncles and aunties that I didn't even know I had, all dressed up in their best black suits, ties, hats and dresses, had filled our little three-roomed house, and they had all sat and talked about my Nana. Some of them were laughing as they told their stories, and some, especially my auntie from down the way, cried and wailed as she told her story, but soon shut up once she had a bottle of Macassin in a dark blue gloved hand. I thought that it was strange that the only person who wasn't there was my Nana. She would have loved to have seen all of her great strapping sons together, and all of her grandbairns, and all of her friends. But now, by the side of the schoolyard, my mother looked very serious indeed, and her hard, steel-tipped heels scratched thin white marks on the pavement. Your Nana, your dad's mum, isn't going to come back. She hasn't gone to sleep like your dad told you. She isn't on holiday or gone to be with the angels. Over my mother's shoulder and through the rust-blistered, green-painted iron school fence I could see Maureen Tinker. She had a thick mop of curly jet-black hair that was moving and bobbing with a frantic swaying of her arm as she was beckoning me to come into the yard and play. She was my best friend in the whole of the infants. We used to charge around at our favourite game of stagecoaches and Indians. With her skipping rope around my waist, we would gallop in and out of the screaming mass of boys and girls, killing renegades and making the range a safer place until it was time for milk. My mother could tell that I wasn't listening, but she continued. There's no easy way to say this. Your Nana is not coming back. She's... Maureen was calling my name out loud and holding a frayed length of her mother's washing line. Just for once, will you listen? She wasn't angry, just exasperated at a boy with a flippity-gibbet mind and no idea how to concentrate. I turned and stared and held my eyes open as wide as I could as I tried and pretended to look into her face. But my real interest in life was going to ask Ginger Nuts to be her horse. My face was really close to my mother's. My eyes were open, but they kept flashing from side to side to see the progress in the yard. Look! She gently held my shoulders. I was really trying to look